secure. Top Hat actually immediately, the grades go straight to me, and they can actually even have them immediately upload to Canvas. Huh? It's way more dynamic than Kahoot. The images will show up on your phone, and I can have you touch the infundibulum of the pituitary gland, and you can actually touch the part too. So you can and then it'll show me a heat map of where people touched, and you can get the feedback, and then you can have your grades always accessible from. I'm going to use it in the fall. Yeah, I'm working on getting everything switched over. They've got a bunch of cool stuff, and they really want me to do it. So they told me they would take all of my quizzes and import it into their program, and I don't have to retype them all. So I'm like, yeah, go ahead. So I think it'll be fun. They've also got some other cool stuff that they do. Okay, so where we were last time, but we went through it kind of quickly. I want to make sure you guys get the names of the parts down as we are actually going through it. So I'm going to go through it just briefly again, and make sure that we talk about the names and the differentiation. So what we were talking about last time is how you got to be a gender, right? So let's make sure that we get the names of the ductwork and sort of the progression down this time. So this is 5-6 weeks post-implantation, and then differentiation happens about that. Some textbooks say 7, but I think this is closer to the truth now. Okay, so what happens at about 5 to 6 weeks post-implantation is in an XY fetus, you have a gene turned on that's on the Y chromosome, and it's either called MIH or MIF. Mullerian inhibiting factor or Mullerian inhibiting hormone. And what it will do is it will cause the degeneration of these pink ducts. These are called the Mullerian ducts or the paramesonephric ducts. I think Mullerian is easier to remember. And in a male, you will degenerate those pink ducts. If you left them to continue, what would happen is those would become the oviducts or fallopian tubes in the uterus. Good? Okay. But in a male, you also need another step in order to continue the development of the male. And that's actually also on the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome, and it's not in your notes, so I don't usually ask about it, but FYI, there's a gene on the Y chromosome called the testes determining factor. And what it does is tells the gonads to differentiate as testes instead of ovaries, and then they'll start producing testosterone. That make sense? Okay. So basically, in order to become a male, you start with the default, and then you have to hit 2 switches at exactly the right time in order for the male to continue this development. When TDF and testosterone and the other androgens start being produced, what will happen is they will continue this development, and you'll have a male that develops that way. In females, all you have to do is leave this the hell alone, and it's going to develop mostly this way. Although the last stage of development to make a woman reproductively viable depends on her producing a little bit of estrogen at that point. So, but the default basics is female. So, and then we did this last time too. So the homologous structures internally are the ovaries are homologous with the testes. Oh, by the way, this is important for when we talk about the androgen insensitivity syndrome again. So everybody starts out with something that's akin to a vagina. Do you see that? And with males, what ends up happening is it just ends up becoming your urethra. And with females, the urethra and the vagina separate. So those yellow structures right there. Okay, so remember this, because if you have this that doesn't continue development, or this that doesn't continue to develop, an XY fetus can have a vagina. So let's talk about that in just a second. Okay, before we get any further, let's just revisit this one more time, and then we'll talk about how you can become intersex or transgender, and we'll talk about those terms and what they mean. So the homologous structures that we talked about last time here was the glands of the clitoris is homologous to the glands of the penis. The labia minora are homologous to what? The skin around the shaft. Now the erectile structures are not in the same place, but we'll talk about erectile structures in just a second. And then the labia majora is homologous to the scrotum. Okay, so now let's talk one more time about that androgen insensitivity syndrome that we were talking about. And sort of the information that we got both from genetic abnormalities and from anecdotal evidence, because people do things accidentally, and then also from animal models. So there are a lot of animals that have the same gender differentiation pattern that we do. So the XX, XY. Most mammals have that gender differentiation. A lot of birds have a different one. So if you want to see how this works, they have figured out that anatomic maleness is not the absence of estrogen, it's the presence of testosterone. And so how have we determined this? Well, there are situations in which a woman accidentally shoots herself up with testosterone at exactly the wrong point in development. So women do sometimes shoot themselves up with testosterone to build muscle mass. If you had a woman who was just exactly the wrong point in development, 5-6 weeks post-implantation, she was messing with her hormones, she might not menstruate regularly, and she probably didn't know she was pregnant. Shoot yourself up, and what can happen is you can flip the anatomic gender of the fetus. Okay, you can't flip the chromosomal gender, but expose a fetus to high levels of testosterone, then what you can get is you can get external genitalia that look more like this than they do like that, right? And that baby would be intersex. Okay, what does intersex mean? Intersex means that your genitals are not strictly typically female or strictly typically male. So with this situation, what you would have is the internal reproductive tract would probably look more female, but the external would look more male. It really depends on when you hit in development. But you're going to have something in between. Does that make sense? So that's actually what intersex means. It means that you are not a typical male, typical female. You're somewhere in between. There are far more intersex people than we know. Right, a lot of people are intersex. And babies are born with weird-looking genitals anyway. Have you ever looked at them? Right, they're all swollen and weird, and it takes a little while before they settle down and look like anything. You're like, is that what that's going to look like? No. Okay, so the other thing is that we've done the same experiments with animal models, like with rats. If we take a rat with an X fetus, and shoot it up with rat testosterone, you can flip the anatomic gender of a rat. So the interesting thing is putting this together with the situation that we talked about last time. The situation we talked about last time was androgen insensitivity syndrome. They used to call this testicular feminization. But when I tell the story a little more slowly, you'll see why they changed the name. So what happens in this particular situation is you have an XY fetus, and this XY fetus is a Y chromosome. MIH is not problematic, and the receptors for MIH are not problematic. So you're going to get degeneration of the Mullerian ducts, which means that you definitely won't have a uterus or fallopian tubes, right? That makes sense? Okay. And then what happens is this SRY turns on and testosterone turns on, but the receptors for androgens, including testosterone, are malformed, and so they don't respond to it. So what you get is from here, you never continue this development. And what you end up looking like is more like this than like that, okay? Because this is sort of the default. So you get degeneration, but then the rest of the development looks very female. So you are going to have a baby born that looks female because the external genitalia default is female. It only develops a penis in the presence of high levels of testosterone. So the baby's born, and you don't go looking around for a uterus in a little baby girl. Nobody really does. You don't have any reason to go looking around for a uterus. So she is going to have female external genitalia, and what she's going to have is a blind vagina that ends, and there's no uterus. Does that make sense? Usually it's shorter than a typical woman's vagina. And a lot of times they'll have to have surgery later. So they got a blind vagina that ends about here, and it's usually sealed. Don't know why it usually seals, but it usually seals, and so it's relatively short. But she's typically female looking and usually won't even be diagnosed until she should start menstruating and doesn't start menstruating. So androgen insensitivity syndrome. What happens is now everybody's junk just sort of stays and doesn't do anything from the time you put it together until puberty. It's just really sitting there in a holding pattern. It's not producing gametes, of course, and it's not producing sex hormones. So she hits puberty, but she doesn't menstruate because she doesn't have a uterus and therefore no endometrium to menstruate. Go ahead.
As far as the receptors for testosterone, wouldn't it act by gene activation?
By gene activation, yeah. So it's intracellular receptors, yeah.
Oh, okay. Like on genes and stuff, right?
Well, it's intracellular in the target cells. But for whatever reason, either the receptors or the signal transduction mechanism can't get the next process going. But it's intracellular receptors. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so
let's talk about what's going to happen with her. So she hits puberty, and she is going to start to produce high levels of testosterone again. You may or may not know this, but estrogen is converted testosterone. So she won't respond to the testosterone, and she's going to produce large quantities of it. She's going to hit puberty a little later than most girls because she's going to hit puberty when boys hit puberty. Does that make sense? And then she's going to produce massive amounts of testosterone because boys do, right? And most of it's going to get converted into estrogen because it's not being used. Estrogen comes from testosterone. And so what's going to happen is she's going to grow relatively tall. She's kind of long-legged and long-limbed. And all of that estrogen is going to make her have medium to large breasts. She's going to have a little bit more muscle mass than most people because of the levels of sex hormones. She's going to be a little slimmer than most people. But she's not going to menstruate. These are photos of androgen insensitivity, women and a little girl. So basically they're very typically female, right? Okay. Usually a little longer limbs and sometimes a slight predisposition to a little bit more facial hair, but it's not major. It's not like they're going to grow beards. So what you get with these girls is that they're leggy, big-breasted supermodels, really. But now you've got an adolescent girl and you've got a diagnosis that is a freaking bomb to try to get to. I mean, think about being 13. Does anybody want to go back? Hell no. You couldn't pay me to go back. Everybody feels like a freak when they're 13 or 14. And so the information that they have to give to her, however they choose to dole it out, is that she's XY. Of course, she's infertile, right? She's never going to have children, right? She has to have immediate surgery to remove those undifferentiated gonads. And she has to have hormone replacement therapy for the rest of her life to maintain her femaleness. And usually reconstructive surgery to make the vagina long enough that it's not uncomfortable to have intercourse. So all of that you have to dole out to a young girl. There have been tons of cases. This one usually gets diagnosed because, of course, she doesn't menstruate, so they take her to the doctor. So we know more about this particular genetic abnormality than we do about a lot of them. A lot of girls have committed suicide. Now they require genetic counseling and counseling when you get the diagnosis, both for the girl and for the family. There was a really famous case in which the family decided not to tell the little girl. Actually, she was like 16, this girl. They decided not to tell her, but then the doctor thought she should know. So the doctor told her. The family sued the doctor for malpractice, and the girl testified for the doctor. He still had an enormous fine for malpractice. She was under 18. So now, here's the interesting part about this that we were talking about last time. So one of the things, and this is something that there's less information for that I was talking to you guys about last time. So what is it that makes you identify as male? Well, we don't know the complete answer, but this gives us a little insight into it because these girls who are anatomically female, at least in the external genitalia, right, and their testosterone receptors don't work, almost invariably, with the relatively smaller sample sizes that we have, gender identify as female. This implies, but does not tell us, that maleness is the presence of testosterone working on the brain. Does that make sense? Because they have testosterone, but their testosterone receptors don't work, right? So they develop as female and gender identify as female, right? So like I said last time, this is a specific physiological known example of someone who is transgender. So if you are transgender, you have all of these determinants of sex and gender, and people argue about which term to use. I'll just stick with the anatomy terms, okay? So you have your chromosomal sex and your hormonal sex and your anatomic sex, right? That makes sense? And then you've got a couple more that people argue about, and then there's psychological sex over here. If you are transgender, one of those doesn't agree. One of those or more doesn't agree with the other one, right? So do you see that these girls actually are transgender, right? By the definition sort of transgender? That their chromosomal and their hormonal sex does not agree with their anatomic sex at the very least, and generally doesn't agree with their psychological sex. Does that make sense? So the other thing besides transgender is cisgender. I don't know if you guys have heard that term before. Most people haven't heard it. Trans and cis, if you know chemistry, you know trans is different and cis is the same.
So cisgender is when all of your determinants of sex agree with one another. And so the vast majority of people are cisgender, but some people are transgender. So this one is an example of how one way that you could become transgender. There are probably far more ways that you could become transgender. We need a lot more study in people that are transgender. And a lot of times what we need is we need to understand both the brains, the chemistry of the brain, and a lot of this is done post-mortem. But you know, our sample sizes for people who have donated their body for post-mortem studies, for gender studies, are so damn small. So there are exactly 2 people who have donated worldwide, historically speaking, who are female to male, transgender, and have donated their brain so that science can actually look at the structure and functional differences in their brain. And you can't get much functional information post-mortem, but you can get some structural differences. And there are 7 people who are male to female. So we have a sample size of 9 to figure this out. Right? So there are a lot of questions that will probably be answered in the future, and hopefully the sample sizes will get a little bigger. Okay, so there are male, intersex, and female anatomic variants, and then there is cisgender and transgender. After birth, your gonads pretty much don't do a damn thing until puberty. What happens at puberty is that there is a hypothalamus hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, that turns on and continues the secondary sex development. Does that make sense? Okay. When yours turns on is sort of gender specific, right? Males tend to hit puberty a little later, but then it's also genetically predisposed. Like if all the women in your family hit puberty at 9, your likelihood of hitting puberty at 9 is far higher, right? So that's got some genetics in it. Now, this question people ask about, so I put it in here. This is out of my depth, but I want to at least acknowledge that it's out of my depth, and also acknowledge the difference between being cisgender, transgender, homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, all that business. So this sexual orientation is a separate issue than either sex or gender. So for instance, I could be a male to female transgender person, me, and I could either be attracted to men or attracted to women. It's an entirely different question. Does that make sense to you guys? So sexual orientation is a separate issue from sex or gender. Is there probably a physiological component? Yeah, there probably is. We don't know what it is. There is also a psychological component. And like with most psychological descriptions, it's probably nature and nurture. Probably both of them come together in a way that's really damn complicated. And male, female, intersex, transgender people can fall anywhere along the spectrum, and it is a spectrum. Okay, the Kinsey study, you guys can go look up the Kinsey scale if you're interested in it. The Kinsey scale was done in 1948 and 1953, and what they did is anonymous surveys, and they've done it since then too, to try to figure out what people, if it's anonymous, what would you report about your sexuality? And they figured out that very, very few people, then and now, are truly homosexual or heterosexual, exclusively, one way or the other. Most people are somewhere in the middle. Okay? And there are also people who are asexual. They're just like, no, nothing, don't want to do any of that. So it was by self-reporting, and then they can also hook up probes to see what your genitals actually respond to, because they don't really lie very much, right? So they're like, that's interesting, not going to tell you. And guess which age range of people generally falls between homosexual and heterosexual, the more experimental age ranges.
15 to 25.
Yeah, pretty much to your 20s, your late teens to your early 20s, are when people are at least more mentally exploratory. I'm not talking about how people behave, right? I don't know what the hell you do, and you probably don't want me to know, and I don't want you to know. But what people report and what people actually find attractive is pretty variable. So that's sexual orientation. I have no business talking about sexual orientation, but people always ask when I talk about transgender and intersex. So you got to put it in there so that at least we've addressed the fact that I don't know what the hell to think about that. Okay, let's talk about female reproductive system anatomy. Now, when we're doing female reproductive system anatomy and male reproductive system anatomy, our course we are talking about completely typical, right? The typical anatomy. There's a tremendous amount of variation. We'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so the female reproductive system anatomy is the one that both males and females usually do worse on. And I think multiple reasons. I don't know. Most of it's inside, first of all. And it's got multiple functions. It's got one extra function in addition to the male reproductive system. So both of them are supposed to produce gametes and hormones, right? But then the female also has to be able to house the development of a fetus and a baby, right? So the terminology. In addition, I suspect, but cannot confirm, that a lot of people confuse ignorance with morality. They say, if I just don't know any of the parts, that means I'm pure as the driven snow. I don't know why people are so crazy about purity. And anyway, everybody started out a virgin. It's not like you won anything. Like, was the default. So we'll talk about this. So this one, typically speaking, the women do worse on the female reproductive tract than the males do. So let's see if you guys can change that for the future. Okay, so 2 functions of the female reproductive, actually 3. Gametes and hormones, and then prepare for and develop support an embryo and a fetus. So I'm not going to teach you guys the entire menstrual cycle in detail, but I just want to talk about it briefly. So I won't test you on the details of this, and it's complicated as hell. But what I want to tell you basically is what the menstrual cycle is the ovaries are the boss of the uterus. Okay? So let's just go through it, and then we'll come back to the ovaries and uterus and reinforce it as we go through there. But what happens is, as the ovaries are ready to ovulate, they need to communicate to the uterus. And what do you think they should tell the uterus to do? Thicken and prepare for an implantation. The hormone that they use to communicate that is progesterone. Okay? Progesterone is pro-gestation, so it's easy to remember what it does, right? And so before and after ovulation, your progesterone levels start to rise, right? And what they are doing is they are saying, prepare for an implantation. And then they wait a reasonable amount of time after ovulation. And after you get out of the window, which is about a week, after you get out of the window in which an implantation could have occurred, your progesterone levels drop. And when your progesterone levels drop, you menstruate, slough the lining of the uterus, start the whole damn thing again in here, but really, even more importantly, you start it again up there. You start maturing an egg, right, and preparing for ovulation, right? So basically, that's what the menstrual cycle is. It's the ovaries telling the uterus what to expect. A baby could be coming is progesterone. A baby ain't coming is low levels of progesterone. What do you think happens if the woman gets pregnant? What happens to her progesterone levels? They should stay high. All things working properly, they should stay high, right, during the entire pregnancy. Some women have trouble with progesterone, and they actually have to supplement progesterone to maintain the pregnancy. Does that make sense? Okay, so how do birth control pills work? It's complicated, but I'll tell you, if anything goes wrong with the timing, you ain't gonna get either ovulation or implantation. And all you have to do is tweak the timing so that your estrogen and your progesterone are not timed properly, and then you won't get ovulation. And if you did get ovulation, hopefully you won't get implantation, right? Most birth control pills are either progesterone only or a combination of estrogen and progesterone. It depends on what your body actually can handle. Okay, so we'll come back to the menstrual cycle just a little bit. So let's go to the female external genitalia. So the female external genitalia is called the pudendum, which means shameful member. Yes, or the vulva. Yes, this was called the pudendum. I don't think it was women who named it, do you? No, women didn't get to do any anatomy. So the pudendum, which I want to move away from, or the vulva. Okay, so let's talk about the parts. The mons pubis, because humans are one of the few species that actually has intercourse face-to-face, smashing those 2 pubic bones together, ouch. So the males and the females both have a little bit of fat on their pubic bone. The female has more fat on her pubic bone. That's called the mons pubis, okay? And then this region down here, we'll talk about the clitoris in detail in just a minute. This is the prepuce that covers the clitoris. These are the labia majora, and in a post-pubertal woman, they generally have pubic hair. The labia minora do not, and those are homologous to what structure in the male?
No, the labia majora is the skin.
Skin and the shaft of the penis. Does that make sense? And then this area that's inside the labia majora is called the vestibule, which means waiting room. Do you want to know where the doorbell is? It's right here. Just so you know. Okay, that's where it is. Okay, so Inside the vestibule, you find some things that you have known about and one that you might not know about. This is the external urethral orifice or the urethral opening, right? And this is the vaginal orifice. Okay, so most people know about that. I can't even tell you how many of my students are not aware that males have 2 holes and females have 3 holes. Like, you definitely should know that, okay? Otherwise you get situations like we were talking about before. The other thing that you may or may not know is that you have openings of glands right here at the bottom end of the vaginal orifice. These are openings for the greater vestibular glands. The greater vestibular glands are homologous to the bulbourethral glands in males. And the bulbourethral glands in males lubricate and cleanse the urethra and lubricate the tip of the penis when a male becomes aroused. And so when a female becomes aroused, the greater vestibular glands will lubricate the openings of the vagina. Now, the vagina has secretions as well, but this is lubricating the openings of the vagina. This is actually where these sit behind the skin. So the greater vestibular glands are sitting right there, and they're actually dumping near the opening. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the external genitalia, and then we'll move in a little bit. So you've also got some more glands. We'll come to the erectile structures in just a second. I want to show you some glands that are actually not pictured in your textbook, but we know at least some women have them. Everybody is arguing about how many women have them. I find it really, really fascinating that we are still arguing about parts of the female anatomy. There's less known than you would imagine, so this is one of the things that people are still arguing about. So in at least some women, and we do not have the proportions yet, and people are still arguing, and it's hard to find, between the anterior wall of the vagina and the posterior urethra, right about where the prostate gland would be in males, right here, is glandular tissue in some women, and those are called Skene's glands. And Skene's glands seem to be responsible for the legendary female ejaculation. Okay, some females have the capacity to produce and secrete ejaculatory fluid when they have an orgasm, not all brands of orgasm, types of stimulation. So people are arguing about this, but let me tell you, in women that do have it, there actually is some decent amount of data. We don't know how many women have it. I have looked for it on cadaver dissections, but it's actually woven into all of the tissue, so you can't find it unless it's a histology, because it's not like you got a whole prostate gland. You've got some glandular tissue within the connective tissue. And then once you find the glandular tissue, you have to figure out what the hell is being secreted from there. So the interesting thing is, in women who have the ejaculation, it actually is not dumped into the vagina, it's actually dumped into the distal end of the urethra. So you can imagine how confusing this would be. They're like, I just peed the damn bed. First time I had sex, peed the bed. So is it urine? Well, that is pretty easily analyzed. All you have to do is analyze the chemical content, and it would have high concentration of urea if it was urine, right? And it has very low concentration of urea, not 0 because it's going through the urethra. But it has a high concentration of PSA, prostate-specific antigen, which is in prostatic fluid that males actually make that's a component of semen. Isn't that interesting? There's an entire Discovery Health special about this, about the women who have female ejaculate. So in at least some women. Now, do all women have this? I don't know. Do only women who have it who developed in like a higher than normal testosterone environment, so you like had development of this thing that's kind of like a prostate gland? I don't know. We don't have enough information. We do know that it exists in some women, okay? I wish I knew how many, but I tried to look for it, this structure, but you would actually have to make histology slides out of it. And then even if you made histology slides, all you could say was that is epithelial secretory tissue, but I wouldn't know what it secreted when she was alive. Does that make sense? So anyway, it's a little bit of a mystery still. Some women do have it. Okay, so those are the paraurethral glands. And then this is in your textbook. We will meet the first of the erectile tissues in the female. So the erectile tissues in the female, most people are not aware that you have massive amounts of erectile tissue in the female. The first ones are these guys right here. These are called the bulbs of the vestibule. Those are homologous to the corpus spongiosum in the male. Do you know what corpus spongiosum is? Surrounds what? Surrounds the urethra, right? Okay. and it's erectile tissue. Okay, so in the male, it ends up surrounding the urethra and becoming erectile tissue. Here in the female, the bulb of the vestibule ends up surrounding the opening of the vagina. Can you see an evolutionary advantage? If the woman becomes aroused, the greater vestibular glands are going to secrete, but in addition, the bulbs of the vestibule are going to become engorged with blood, and that will tighten the opening of the vagina, which increases the likelihood of ejaculation, and it's pro-baby, right? Which is an evolutionarily solid strategy right there. Does that make sense? So these are the bulbs of the vestibule. That's the first ones you're going to meet. Good? Okay. Okay. So now let's talk about the clitoris. So there's fascinating sort of history with what we know and don't know about the clitoris. We are still discovering how the clitoris is all connected. And the last bit of information about the connectivity of the clitoris was only discovered in 1990. 2009. That is shameful. What the hell? So 2009, they figured out basically how it was all wired up. And what they figured out is these three structures are all erectile tissue, and they are wired together. We don't know how the sensory and motor wiring goes, but we know that they share blood flow and share nerve endings. So the bulbs of the vestibule, and then these, which are called the crus or crura of the clitoris, and then the body of the clitoris with the glands at the end. So what you see when you're looking at the external genitalia here is the tip of the iceberg. All of that is erectile structures that are behind the wall. Does that make sense? So when a woman becomes aroused, what will happen is very similar to what happens when a male becomes aroused. So you get all of these erectile structures filling up with blood. You tighten the opening of the vagina, and then these guys right here are connected to the body. And so I want you to think of these and the body like a pool float that's flopped over. And then you're going to blow it up. Boop. Right? Same structure in the male. It's just like a little teeny penis. Right? So if you look at it from a mid-sagittal section on a woman, you can see, this doesn't show most of the structure, you can see that since this is pushed up against the connective tissue and bone, as soon as it starts to engorge with blood, what happens is the clitoris actually stands up. That makes sense? Okay, so we will see that the male structures are very, very similar to this. So if you are doing it properly, both people will have an erection. Both of them, before you even start going anywhere. Okay, so as far as the innervation of the clitoris, our current information, which admittedly is not quite as solid as it should be, says that the glands of the clitoris has 8,000 sensory nerve endings, and they think that the glands of the penis has fewer. But there is some, it shouldn't have fewer, it should have the same, because it's the same hookup. What they think is that perhaps when males are circumcised, and then the glands rubs against their clothes their entire life before they become sexually active, it actually diminishes some of the sensory nerve endings. So they think they actually may be losing some in adulthood. And so we actually don't have a good sample. So they need to look at uncircumcised males in order to figure out whether the sensation is actually dramatically different. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So when we get to males. The prepuce is this skin fold that's covering the glands, right? And in most women, there's variation in the size of the clitoris, but in most women, the prepuce partially or completely covers the glands, unless the woman is aroused. Okay, so, let's talk about what these are homologous to. So the erectile structures that are in the body of the clitoris are the same structures as the paired corpora cavernosa in the males. Remember the corpora cavernosa, the two erectile bodies, right? Those end up in there, okay? And the corpus spongiosum ends up out here. And these are erectile bodies that are the same in males and females. They're both of them back there, the crus, and we'll talk about the crus in a minute. Okay? Okay. Let's see. Did you guys see the clitoris models in lab? Yeah? My students 3D printed those so that you could see what the structures actually look like. They're really cool. You can just hold them up and nobody knows what the hell they are. You're like, hey, what is this body part? Literally no idea. No idea what you're talking about. What? It is, yes. Okay, so let's move to the ovaries.
I don't know why I went from the clitoris to the ovaries. It seems like I would have just moved up, but who the hell knows? Okay, so ovaries. Okay, so the ovaries have multiple functions. They produce gametes and they produce estrogen and progesterone. They also produce some other hormones, but those are the two major ones. They are homologous to the male testes. Weird little anatomical tweak that you may or may not be aware of is that the ovaries are actually not connected to the oviducts or fallopian tubes. I would like to talk to the management about this. So what happens is your ovary is sitting out here and the oviducts or fallopian tubes are sitting on it or near it. And under high levels of progesterone, they'll actually sort of fold over it, but it's not sealed. Okay? And keep that in mind because we'll talk about ectopic pregnancies in just a second. So they're actually not as connected as you would imagine. And so when you ovulate, you actually ovulate and hope it goes into the fallopian tubes. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. We'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, so let's look at the actual structures of the ovary. So this is the ovarian ligament, which means the ovary, the uterus would be right here. Okay, this is not connecting. It's not a tube connecting into the uterus. It's just holding it. Okay, the fallopian tube would be over there. You guys with me? Okay. So as far as the parts of the ovary goes, let's do tissue layers, and then we'll talk about functionality. The outermost layer. It's called the germinal epithelium. It is in contact with, maybe even part of, the visceral peritoneum, right? Okay. And then we move in one layer. This layer right here, a male also has this one around the testis. This is called the tunica albuginea. And the tunica albuginea is basically mostly connective tissue. One of the interesting things during ovulation is that you actually have to bust through the wall. Some women have a little bleeding or spotting every single time they ovulate. This is also the reason that ovarian cysts are outrageously painful. They actually cause damaging of the tissue as they're bursting. So this figure right here is actually a live figure that's showing ovulation occurring. So this is an ovary, and this is the egg actually being ovulated and busted out of the wall of the ovary. It's kind of gross, but also kind of cool. Like all of anatomy. Okay, so let's go through the rest of the tissue layers and then we'll hook it back up to the rest of the body. Okay, so you guys know ovaries and testes go through meiosis, yes? And what they're doing is trying to reduce a 46 chromosome cell to 23. So with that, when you get fertilization, you get a normal fertilization with 46 chromosomes again. So basically, the big picture of the ovary is that what happens is you are born with 1.5 million to 2 million of these. People always tell you you're born with all the eggs you're ever going to have, but that's not quite true. You're born with all of the egg-producing structures you're ever going to have. Okay, that's not true for sperm. Okay, so these guys right here are 46 chromosomes, and what happens is after a woman hits puberty, she will one of these in one ovary per each cycle will start the maturation process. And the maturation process, in addition to reducing the chromosome size, it's also giving this big supporting structure called follicle. So it's reducing chromosome number, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and then ovulating. Does that make sense? And so this thing, it's an oversimplification. This thing, when it's fertilized, should get 46 chromosomes again. Okay? Now, as this is occurring, in addition, the ovary is producing progesterone, right? It's saying more progesterone, more progesterone, more progesterone. But after you ovulate, you still have to continue producing progesterone. So this structure that was supporting the egg continues to produce progesterone for about a week, and then it gives up if no implantation occurs. If implantation occurs, then the uterus tells the ovary and the rest of the body that implantation has occurred and says, I need you to continue making progesterone. If implantation does not occur, then this starts to degenerate and you start the whole damn thing over again, right? Every 28 days or so. So the part that does all the action with the ovary is the ovarian cortex. The medulla is primarily where the vessels come and go, and this is the hilus or hilum. Okay? So what is true about women is that you are born with all of those 1.5 to 2 million follicles that could make eggs.
Over the normal course of a woman's reproductive life, she'll ovulate about 400 of those. So the rest of them just degenerate. It's called follicular atresia. Now, what happens with women, though, that doesn't happen with men, it's kind of interesting, is that you don't get any more primordial follicles. Those age with you, okay? And when they age with you, you increase the likelihood of having chromosome abnormalities because you just are not quite as good at doing meiosis. So when a woman, I haven't looked at the stats lately, but the last time I looked at this, because I actually used to teach it and I used to work for a genetic counseling service. If you have a baby when you're like 19, your likelihood of having a chromosome abnormality because of a meiotic mistake is something like 1 in 4,000. But by the time you're in your 40s, it's 1 in 16. Yeah, so it increases super dramatically with women, okay? So these chromosome abnormalities. So let's talk about men just briefly and figure out why it's not the same in men. It's a couple of things. In men, the place that you do spermatogenesis is these tubes in the testes called seminiferous tubules. And these, what they do is they start out at 46 chromosomes and they go through meiosis as well and make 23 chromosomes sperm. But what they also do is go through mitosis and make fresh ones all the time. Do you see? So they're not aging with the male in the same way. Now, do chromosome abnormalities increase slightly in proportion in males as they age? Yeah, very slightly, but they've got statistics on their side because most women will produce 1 egg per month, right? And in a male, it is not unusual to have 350 million sperm per ejaculate. And now they are all racing. Do you think the gimpy one usually wins? No, it doesn't. Right? You got 1 egg, that's the one that's going to get fertilized if one does, right? You got 350 million sperm, and the ones that are most likely to make it are the ones that are most healthy and most robust. Is that okay? Okay, so males are the source of chromosome abnormalities, but nowhere near as often as females. And by chromosome abnormalities, anything other than 46XX or 46XY is a chromosome abnormality. You can have 3 chromosome 21s, that's trisomy 21, which is one of the causes of Down syndrome, but not the only one. You can have trisomy 18, that one's nasty. Most of them will not make it past the first trimester. Your body identifies it as a chromosome abnormality. Okay, so I think we got everything there. Okay, supports for ovaries. By the way, I don't know why. It's probably because it's boring. Some of the most missed things on the lab are holding the reproductive tract up. Okay, so let me point these out to you as we go along. The way that I remember them is not where they are, but what they're actually supposed to hold to what. So some of the supports of the ovaries, these guys right here, it should be continuous, but this guy right here actually holds the ovary to the body wall, so it's called the suspensory ligament. Does that make sense? Okay. This one right here goes between ovary and uterus. It's not a tube, it's a ligament. It's an ovarian ligament. Then this guy right here goes behind the ovaries and supports both the ovary and the uterus, and that's called the broad ligament. Okay. These are the ones that people always miss in lab. I don't know why. Not interesting, I guess. Okay. Ovarian cancer, briefly. Ovarian cancer, we talked about it at the beginning of the semester. Let's revisit it. Ovarian cancer, not surprisingly, occurs in the epithelial tissues, because most cancers do. So the germinal epithelium here will start to divide abnormally. We don't know why, but we do know that it's the third leading cause of cancer-related deaths in women, fourth leading cause, sorry. It's not as common as breast and cervical cancer, but it usually gets diagnosed too late. Because what it does is it's right under the peritoneum, right? And it irritates the peritoneum and it manifests as like stomach aches for months. And so you don't catch it in stage 1, you catch it in stage 3. Does that make sense? So that's why it's really hard to diagnose, and it's almost always germinal epithelium. Okay, uterine tubes, fallopian tubes, whatever the hell you want to call them, they are moving away from using the term fallopian tubes. It's now uterine tubes or oviducts. So let's look at these guys and figure out about ectopic pregnancies and all of that kind of stuff. So with these guys, so you can see that where they start, they actually sort of wrap around strangely like this. Here's the ovary and they wrap around. So this first part, the big wide part, is called the infundibulum, and it's got these little fimbriae on it. Under high levels of estrogen, what happens is the fimbriae fold onto the ovary, so to increase the likelihood that it'll actually go in the right place. So this is the infundibulum, this is the ampulla. This is the usual site of fertilization. Not implantation, but fertilization. So the sperm swims all the way up here. Fertilization generally occurs there. Okay, this narrower part right here is called the isthmus, and this is called the uterine part, or sometimes the interstitial segment. Notice that it's relatively rare, and of course if fertilization occurs here, you start immediately going through cell division, 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, right? If this is scarred, you will have trouble getting that egg through, and sometimes it can implant in the tube. A pregnancy that is anywhere other than the uterus is called an ectopic pregnancy. It means out of place. One form of ectopic pregnancy is a tubal pregnancy. These cannot be carried to term, and they are life-threatening for the woman. Okay? They will continue to try to grow. In addition, when they do that, they will also cause scarring and damaging of the tube. So the reason that that often occurs is because the tube was scarred from something else, and the egg just can't get through. But the other kind of ectopic pregnancy is that this thing sometimes doesn't go into the fallopian tube at all. It's just like hanging out in here in the peritoneal cavity. And then, even though nobody gave consent for this, if a woman has sex, the semen stays here, but the sperm keeps swimming. And the sperm swims past the cervix. And of course, it almost always goes up here, right, into the ampulla. It can keep going out to the peritoneal cavity. Okay? And then you can have fertilization occurring in the peritoneal cavity, and then it can try to implant. And it tries to implant sometimes on your bladder, sometimes on your digestive tract. Those cannot be carried to term, and they are life-threatening for the woman as well, and they're going to continue to try to grow, right? Because your body doesn't know it's in the wrong place. It continues to secrete the hormones, right? So those ectopic pregnancies are life-threatening for the woman. The only one that I've ever read that was actually carried almost to term, they actually delivered at the beginning of the 3rd trimester, is 2 cases of an ectopic pregnancy that implanted on the outer surface of the uterus. So it had access to the same blood supply. And it was really, really risky for this woman to try to carry it to term, 2 women, about 15 years apart. And they carried it in, and the baby lived and the mom lived. Obviously, you can't deliver vaginally, and they had to deliver it earlier than they should have. But the baby actually lived, and I actually looked up the research article. So it lived implanting on the side. So, okay, so uterine tubes. The tissue making up uterine tubes. You actually kind of learned this before. So, do you remember what kind of tissue lines your uterine tubes or fallopian tubes?
Ciliated columnar.
Yeah, it's ciliated simple columnar. And so what happens is, again, under high levels of progesterone, those cilia are going to start to wave toward the uterus. They call it courting of the oocyte. It's a little late for courting at that point, but courting of the oocyte. And then there's smooth muscle in the wall as well, and the smooth muscle will cause like a peristaltic pull, right? Which is why apparently this works pretty effectively most of the time, because there's 7 billion people on the planet, right? Apparently it's doing okay. All right, so infundibulum, ampulla, we did all of that. Oh, pelvic inflammatory disease. This is worth talking about. So if a woman gets an infection in the reproductive tract, generally starts with vagina, right? Now it doesn't have to be an STD, but of course sex is the most likely place for you to get an infection of the vagina, because you're like involving the vagina in the process. So chlamydia and gonorrhea are famous for causing pelvic inflammatory disease. You could, however, also have a pathogen that moves from your digestive tract, if you're wiping wrong, right, into your vagina, or your urinary tract if you had a UTI, okay? Regardless of how it occurs, remember that the whole damn thing is open, so the infection can go from the vagina up to the uterus, up to the fallopian tubes. It can even make it into the peritoneal cavity. It's not common, but it can. And these guys are narrow to begin with. If you irritate them and form scar tissue, then you can actually decrease fertility dramatically just by forming scar tissue in one of them. Does that make sense? Okay. And of course, it also increases your likelihood of tubal pregnancies. Okay, so this is one really good reason for women to talk about protecting their reproductive health. So if you are sexually active, right? Or even if you have been sexually active, a lot of times pelvic inflammatory disease is asymptomatic. And you're like, it doesn't matter, I'm not planning on having kids. A lot of people think they're not planning on having kids at 22, and then at 35 they want to, and they figure out that they can't. A lot of times this is related to pelvic inflammatory disease. The scarring of your fallopian tubes when you didn't even know that scarring of your fallopian tubes was possible. So, I know in Utah we try to pretend that nobody has sex unless they're married, but I'm not from here. So if you want to protect your reproductive health, and you are not both completely vestal virgins, and by the way, one of you's lying anyway, completely vestal virgins who are never going to have another partner and haven't had one in the past, you may want to consider using condoms, right? To protect your health, protect your reproductive health for the future. And they are not even allowed to talk about that in schools. They're not allowed to talk about condoms. Okay, so that's ectopic or tubal pregnancies, and really common source of infertility in women. Okay, so let's talk about the uterus. Okay, so the uterus, the parts of the uterus. This is, of course, the womb, right? This is where the baby would develop. This is the fundus. It's this rounded part that's on top. This is the body of the uterus, and then the isthmus of the uterus, and then this is the cervix. Most people have no idea how the cervix is. So, honestly, they don't. So let's talk about function and structure of the uterus and also histology of the uterus. So if you look at a mid-sagittal section of the uterus, make sure you can find it. On a mid-sagittal section, this is the uterus, this is the urinary bladder, not flip-flop, right? You should be able to count the openings in order, right? Urethra before vagina, before anus. So we're not going to make any of those mistakes, right? And have somebody who's 85 years old and has been having sex through the urethra. You count. Right? You can get out a book and look it up if you really need to, right? So we want to make sure. So this is the uterus. In a woman who is not pregnant, the uterus kind of folds over the urinary bladder. When a woman is aroused, it pops up, interestingly, and if she has an orgasm, it dips down into the vagina and pulls back up. Any idea why that would happen? Yeah, try and get the little sperms, right? You're getting them up there. So that's part of what's happening internally when a woman is orgasmic. Orgasmic women tend to be more fertile. But apparently it doesn't really matter because you can get pregnant when you didn't have anything to do with the entire process. But so the uterus folds over. In women who have not had a pregnancy, it's about pear-shaped, pear-sized. In women who have had a pregnancy, it's way bigger and it never goes back to the original shape, just like everything else. It is really thick-walled, tons of musculature in the wall. And so the fundus, the body, the isthmus, and the cervix we already went through, so let's look at the supports of it. It's got some weird support structures. Okay, where are you? Lost it. Oh, okay. Now I'm missing one. I want a different picture. Hold on, I lost the uterus. Where's the picture I was looking at? That's not the one I had before. Oh, there it is. Okay. So as far as the supports, this is the transverse cervical ligament. This is mostly holding on to the vagina, but it's got like the bottom part right here, so it's a little bit of overlap. This is the broad ligament, which we already learned. It supports both the uterus and the ovary. And then you have this weird ligament. The round ligament go from the fundus of the uterus and they go toward the pelvic wall. Believe it or not, this little weird thing actually goes out the inguinal canal and inserts onto the labia majora. So basically it's the structure that has a really understandable function in males, like holding on to what's in the labia majora, and it just actually goes out there in females. Not like particularly important to hold things on to the labia majora. It's not holding your labia up, right? That's what the round ligament does. And then the other thing that is really super important for holding the reproductive tract of the female in place is that you've got these muscles these skeletal muscles that form the wall of the pelvic floor, and it's called the Urogenital Triangle or the Pubococcygeal muscles. And those muscles being intact is what holds your junk up, okay? And it doesn't sound that particularly important until you rip all of these muscles. If you have a baby that's big-headed and you didn't actually have the opportunity to care for these muscles, you can rip all of them. And because those muscles are not just related to urinary incontinence or continence, they're also related to holding things up structurally. If you destroy the pelvic floor, then you can have a uterine prolapse and your uterus actually flops out. Yep, uterus, it doesn't like flop out of your body, but it's hanging out in the skin between your legs, right? They need to teach this in maturation. Oh, it'll keep those kids from having some sex, won't it? Like, it's gonna flop out. So those are called the pubococcygeal muscles or the pelvic floor muscles. And those muscles, I think you guys mentioned this last time. I think she mentioned this last time. These muscles, if they're not damaged, you can actually exercise these muscles. And when you exercise these muscles, you're less likely to have urinary incontinence in both males and females. And you're also less likely to have your junk fall out, although if you rip them, it's going to be really hard to exercise them. These are called Kegel exercises. Males can do them too. And in males and females, they have some advantages. In males and females, they help to reduce the likelihood of urinary incontinence. And in females, of course, they can tighten the opening of the vagina. And in males, they actually help to control erection and ejaculation. So you have a little bit more control over how long you can keep things going. So pubococcygeal muscles. All right, so let's cover the histology. We'll stop at the end of the uterus. We'll do the vagina next time. Okay, histology of the uterus. So this one's kind of interesting. Where are you? Oh, that's the vagina. Okay, so with the uterus, what we have is we have these layers in the wall. We've got the endometrium, which is the inner layer. We've got the myometrium, which is the muscle. And we've got the perimetrium, which is the connective tissue on the outside, or sorry, serous membrane on the outside, okay? Now, obviously you can understand the functionality of the musculature, right? You're gonna have to squish that baby out of there. The endometrium is, of course, this highly vascular lining that increases in thickness in the presence of progesterone. So what happens, here's the myometrium, and here's the endometrium. Women always keep this layer of the endometrium, which is called the basal layer, and it's got a bunch of blood vessels in it and a bunch of glands in it. And then the basal layer will grow a new functional layer every cycle in the presence of progesterone. And then when the progesterone drops, you shed the functional layer, right? And then you get the functional layer again, and then shed the functional layer. Does that make sense? So you are actually not menstruating fluid. You are menstruating really, really vascular tissue. Right? Now, of course, some fluid is going to leave as well because it's really vascular tissue, but it's actually tissue that you're losing every single menstrual cycle. Does that make sense? Okay. The blood supply to the uterus is from the internal iliac arteries, and they give rise to the uterine arteries, which shouldn't surprise you. So the last thing we'll talk about today is endometriosis and cervical cancer. So let's talk about the cervix just a little bit. The cervix is this part of the uterus that projects into the vagina, right? It's surrounded by the vagina. Do you see that? Okay. The function of the cervix is during pregnancy and in presence of high levels of progesterone over long periods of time, the cervix closes because it's holding the baby in there while it's baking, right? And then during the process of parturition or childbirth, it's oxytocin that allows for cervical dilation and the baby to come out. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what the cervix is, and that's the thing that they're looking in there to see if it's dilated, right? So they look in the vagina to assess how dilated the cervix is to figure out whether the baby is actually ready to come out. Okay, so, but for some odd reason, the cervix has really, really high instances of cancer. The epithelial tissue that's actually lining the cervix, I think I've got a picture of these epithelial cells from the cervix. Hold on just a second. Oh, there it is. Okay, thank histology again, because in this particular instance, you should be able to tell normal cervical epithelial cells from abnormal ones. And you can see that when you do a scrape, which is called a pap smear, when they scrape your cervix, they send it off to a pathologist, they put it on a slide and stain it so that you can see whether the nuclei look normal or abnormal. You can see that they're abnormal, right? They're going through abnormal cell division. So this is an abnormal pap smear. Does this person necessarily have cervical cancer? No, but abnormal pap smears increase the likelihood of cervical cancer. And so now, what they did, even though it doesn't have anything particularly to do with the fact that you want a birth control prescription, somebody is making you get your cervix checked every single time you want a birth control prescription, because cervical cancer used to kill young women left, right, and center, even though it's a relatively slow-growing cancer. So it's a pretty slow-growing cancer. Where is it? Like, yeah. Okay. It's a pretty slow-growing cancer, and it's pretty easy to prevent it from becoming malignant and metastasizing. But it used to kill a bunch more women, and still now, more than 50% of people with cervical cancer have cervical cancer because they never got a pap smear. Because if you catch the cells when they're still precancerous, you can usually just scrape them off or burn them off and then go back for more frequent pap smears, right? So this is an interesting thing about cervical cancer. It's the third most common gynecological malignancy, and it is associated with HPV. So this is the time for us to talk about the HPV vaccines and the whole Utah business about HPV vaccines. So human papillomavirus is asymptomatic most of the time in both genders. So you will not know that you have it, and he's not necessarily going to have genital warts, which would be a bit red flag. He'd be like, hell no! So, but it's asymptomatic in both genders much of the time. But what happens in women is exposure to HPV, even if it's asymptomatic, increases her lifetime risk of cervical cancer, right? So women who are sexually active have an increased risk of cervical cancer. Cervical cancer also just occurs with anyone. So what happens now is that if I want some kind of prescription birth control, they say that I have to come in and get a pap smear. It is looking, not strangely enough, the pap doesn't stand for human papillomavirus. It stands for the guy who figured out this technique called Papa Nicolau. So they scrape the cells, and then if it's fine, then you don't have to go back in. But it doesn't have anything to do with birth control at all, right? It's not even related to it at all. So now, human papillomavirus is rampant in Utah. It's just freaking everywhere. Everybody who is sexually active, they say over 70% of people who are sexually active in Utah
I hear
have
everyone
HPV.
has HPV, but there's different strains.
There are different strains.
Like there's like normal strains, so like everyone has, like there's just germs everywhere, and then there's the harmful strains. And
There's the harmful strains that cause genital warts, and there are certain strains that increase your likelihood of cervical cancer really dramatically. Go ahead.
So there's that vaccine that was made for women.
Gardasil.
Okay, why is that getting a lot of flash?
Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about before we left this concept. So strangely enough, this is a weird thing to me in Utah. There's a vaccine everywhere, but there's a vaccine for human papillomavirus, and it's been tested. Girls are able, I think this is right now, it changes a little bit every year, they test on new groups, but I think girls are allowed to get it as early as 11.
really?
Yeah, and boys are allowed to get it as early as 11 now, and it used to be different for the different genders. And you can't get it past a certain age. I think you can't get it past 27. Can't remember. And it really has to do with which population groups it's been tested in, right? That's primarily what it's got to
That's
do.
weird because they don't advertise it to males very often.
Yeah, they do in other states. So,
and they're like, you should get this, but
yeah.
guys I don't think get it as much. I mean, I think they should probably have a little bit more.
Yeah, so it's a strange thing here in this state. It's really not very controversial in California, but here in this state, my gynecologist actually I ask them about it. I'm like, so do many people get the HPV vaccine? And he's like, well, I tell all of my patients, and I tell the girls when they're young, if they're 13 and they haven't had it, that you should go get that. But a lot of parents do not want their children to get the HPV vaccine because they think it actually gives some kind of permission for sexuality.
So what you're actually saying, this is like what I had this conversation with my gynecologist. This is an editorial comment. Throw it out if you want to. But what you're actually saying is I would rather they get cancer than have sex, right? I would rather, like, I want them to be a virgin so much that I'm willing to risk that they get cancer.
They were actually saying that it's actually more dangerous to get it, which I thought was like back with the other vaccine debates.
It's not
How
more
there's all
dangerous
this
to get
stuff. I know, yeah.
Yeah.
I got it like
It's
a
interesting,
month
'cause I'm
after it
like-
came out, and everyone was like, "Don't do it." So it's like not
was
like
Go ahead.
sit
the
out
one
and
that
people
people
are gonna do that.
So with both of my older daughters, our pediatrician used the, I'm trying to think the story of like 1 in 3 kids in Utah get sexually abused before they're 18.
Maybe you can. I hate that that's the way that you can appeal to people. Like you may
She's
get
like,
to
if you go that route, more parents are more willing to allow their
interesting.
children to get it.
Well, in addition, you let's say you go all the way to your marriage and you are not sexually active until you're married. There's absolutely no guarantee that your partner was not,
Right.
right? You have to protect your own health because I don't care what they tell you. Everybody lies about sex and their weight. So they lie about both things just constantly, right? Because neither one of them is anybody else's damn business, right? So girls can get it. Of course, it's very protective for the girls. Boys don't get it very often here in Utah, although my son's getting it as for a birthday present when he turns 11 this summer. So when boys don't get it very often. What they are doing is they are protecting their partner. The HPV that males get, it's slightly protective against genital warts, but they don't have a cervix and they ain't going to get cervical cancer, but they can pass HPV on to their partner who will get cervical cancer. So the argument for boys getting it is a little less close to home. And so anyway, it is controversial here in Utah. It's kind of tragic that it's controversial because it actually protects against cancer for the rest of their life. Okay, the last thing to talk about and then we'll leave is endometriosis. So what the hell is endometriosis? And the answer is that we don't know as much about it as we should. We do know that the endometrium forgets that it's supposed to stay at home and starts traveling. And under the influence of progesterone, every cycle, what will happen is the endometrium will start to grow like it always does. But this endometrium in somebody with endometriosis doesn't stay in the uterus. It can move into the fallopian tubes, which can cause scarring when you slough it off every time, right? It can move out of the fallopian tubes into the peritoneal cavity. It can start to grow on your intestines, your urinary bladder. When it gets super bad, it grows all the way up to the diaphragm. So it's almost like a cancer, but it respects the boundaries of the peritoneal cavity. And it's really, really hormonally influenced. And so what happens is every single month under the influence of progesterone, it increases and grows. But then when your progesterone drops, you try to slough it off. And it feels bad enough coming off of the uterus. How do you think it feels coming off of your intestines? So it's really, really painful. It increases your lifetime risk of infertility because it damages the fallopian tubes. How do you cure it? You don't really. A lot of times people have to have a complete hysterectomy to cure it. Sometimes it goes away when a woman gets pregnant because it like upsets your hormones so much. So a lot of times with women who have endometriosis early, they say if you're going to have a baby, you should have one now to a girl who's 18, right? Sometimes it cures the endometriosis. And also the lifetime risk of infertility increases as you have the endometriosis. They sometimes treat it with birth control pills because if you can screw up the cycling, then sometimes you won't have as much pain. But a lot of times it doesn't work, right? Unless you just, eventually sometimes they just take everything out because it's trashing your entire peritoneal cavity. So that's what endometriosis is. Okay, we'll stop there for today. What?
Makes me want to donate my body.
I already am. I'm donating mine. So I'm sure some of my students will end up cutting me up.